Hey guys, today I'm going to reveal to you 3 secrets that professional growers know about growing tomatoes that home gardeners don't know, and it makes a huge difference in the overall production. Even though your tomato plants can look healthy, they may not give you a great harvest. So by implementing these 3 secrets is going to make a huge difference. So guys, most home gardeners grow tomato plants, but a professional grower is growing a tomato production system. And there's a lot of detail in there, but it's just 3 simple secrets that those growers know that the average homeowner does not know, or the average grower doesn't know, that makes a huge difference, whether you're growing on an apartment balcony or inside of an open ground area in your yard. So let's go through those, but I'm going to tell you that there's one thing that professional growers do. They don't think about growing just a bushy tomato plant or a tall vining plant. They're thinking about growing a tomato producing plant that just consistently produces more and more tomatoes as the season goes on. So I'm going to give you these 3 simple secrets that will make a huge difference in growing your tomatoes and the amount they will produce for you. Now I wanted to give you a close-up of this cherry tomato plant, and they're just loaded with cherry tomatoes, as well as my other ones that's showing growth, flowering, and all things. But I want to tell you what a professional grower is thinking when he grows. He's thinking, how do I control the roots, the leaves, the flowers, the soil moisture, the calcium flow, the plant stress level, and the fruit load, so that the plant is forced to produce. So that's essentially what we're talking about, is forcing your tomato plants to produce more than you could ever need in one season, just from a few plants. You don't have to have an entire garden of tomatoes. Just a few plants will give you more tomatoes than you'll be able to eat in an entire season. Now in this bed, I've got 3 different types of tomatoes, 2 on each row here, and they have tripled in size in a very short amount of time. So these secrets will make a huge difference in a short amount of time. Probably less than 2 weeks, I've seen massive growth from all 6 of these tomato plants and all 3 varieties that are planted side by side. One here, and one here. So let's head back into the greenhouse and I'll review some more things you need to know, and we'll talk about those 3 major secrets to growing tomatoes. Now I will tell you, as with a lot of my videos, I have created a PDF that you can download from my Patreon. You can go there. If you're a member, you can download it at no charge. If you're already a member, if you're not a member, you can just buy it outright, and it's only a few dollars there. But that will give you an extreme amount of detail. I'm going to have to limit this video to under probably 20 minutes, so I can't give you every single thing that might come up in this entire process, every question that might pop into your head. So if you want to, take a look at that PDF, download it, save it to your device, print off a copy, whatever you need to do. And then that way, when you're growing your tomatoes, you can go back to that PDF and it will answer almost every question you might possibly have about this 3 secret process. So I'll give you the 3 titles of the 3 secrets. The first one is root zone engineering, and that is very important because a lot of people just stick their tomato plant in the ground, whether they're growing in a pot or in the ground or in a raised garden bed, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So you want to focus on root zone management or root zone engineering. So that's the first secret, and I'm going to go into a lot more detail on all of these 3 secrets, but that's number 1. So number 2 is controlled stress for fruit production, and this is how professionals do this. They will cause light stress on the plant to increase fruit production. That's number 2 in our 3 secrets. Last but not least is calcium flow management. So a lot of times you'll see blossom end rot on your plants, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. We want to keep a lot of calcium flowing into the fruit from the ground and making sure that the plant is healthy as it can be and producing as much as it can be. So let's go into greater detail on each of the 3 secrets that the pros know that most gardeners don't. Now this is a mortgage lifter, these 2 on the end, and I said there's 3 different types in this bed, but what we're talking about now is how to build a pro style tomato root zone. We want to start with a deep planting hole. We don't want a shallow planting hole. We want it to, when I first planted this one, this particular tomato plant was 50% under the soil, even though it was quite a bit taller. So tomatoes are different from many vegetables because they can grow roots along the buried stem tissue, specifically on the nodes. You may not be able to see them here, but there's some nodes there, and once those are planted under the soil level, roots can branch out from there and start really growing better. So just remember, when you're planting your tomato plant, you don't want to plant it whatever size container. If it's a 2-inch container, 3-inch container, you don't want to plant it at the soil level. You want to remove the lower leaves and berry part of the stem. You want to leave the top healthy leaves above the soil, keep the growing tip above the ground, do not bury diseased leaves, remove those, and do not bury leaves that are touching the soil. So just remember, when you do this at below the planting level, you want to make sure you're not putting leaves in the soil, because that can cause diseases. So this is going to create a larger root system, and a larger root system means more water access, more nutrient access, better drought tolerance, stronger anchoring, more stable growth, and better support when you're heavy fruiting. When this has a lot of tomatoes on it, even though I have tomato cages, the plant can have a lot stronger main stem and it won't fall over as easy in a heavy rainstorm or some blowing wind. Now this one is a Better Boy Plus, and it's another one of my favorite tomato plants, started from seed. Originally I purchased the plant, and then each year I saved the seeds. But if your tomato seedlings are a little bit on the leggy side, you want to do what's called the trenching method. So you're going to dig a shallow trench horizontally instead of a deep vertical hole. You're going to remove the lower limbs as always, lay the tomato plant sideways, then gently bend the top upwards to above the soil. Make sure there's no leaves touching the soil, as I said earlier, and then we're going to cover the buried stem with the soil. We're going to water in deeply, and we're going to keep the top 4 to 8 inches above the ground. But you also may want to have something like a stake so you can prop it up, whether it's something like a small tomato cage or a paint stick like this one. But you just want to make sure that even though it's in that position of laying down mostly, you want that last part vertically standing up. So we don't want it completely horizontally growing, but the bottom part of the plant, the bottom 2/3, is going to be horizontal with under the soil. So the reason this works is the buried stem produces extra roots. The root zone stays warm and near the soil surface. The plant becomes stronger over time. The tomato develops a wider feeding area, and the weak seedling is turned into a very strong plant. Now, I wanted to give you kind of an overall view of the planting beds, and there's over 20 raised beds out here, but there's a rule that I do each year. I add some compost to each bed, organic matter, but remember, don't overdo it in your tomato plants. I usually use anywhere from 3 to 6 bags of black cow composted manure. But one thing to remember is with your tomatoes, you can overdo it by having excess nitrogen, which will cause too much leaf growth, delayed flowering, soft stems. You can have fungus gnats in your containers if you're using it in that type of environment. You'll have waterlogged soil, you'll have nutrient imbalance, and you'll have excess salts if the compost is too strong. So for garden beds, a good ratio is existing soil as the base, and then 20% of finished mixed compost into the planting area. So just remember, extra compost is used as a top dress later, not packed into the overall hole or where you're planting. Now, if you're growing your tomatoes on a patio rather than a raised bed or open ground, there's a ratio that you need to do to make sure that you're engineering the soil properly so you'll have the same result. You want 50% of a really good quality potting mix, and then you want 25% of finished compost, and the last 25% something like this, perlite or even very finely shredded pine bark. Now, perlite is easy to find, and at the big box store Lowe's in America, they have shredded pine bark, and it's called soil conditioner in a very large bag. So you can mix that into the soil in your container plants to make sure that you have the proper amount of oxygen mixed in with your soil, your H2O, because if you do have a really heavy soil, your tomatoes can become diseased and they cannot produce because they don't have a properly engineered, I keep saying it over and over, but a properly engineering root zone is what we're talking about in this first secret. So in engineering that root zone with something like I mentioned, the pine bark or the perlite here, we're just creating a very, very oxygen-rich environment that's going to help the root system, because if you know anything about plants, many plants will drown if there's not proper drainage. So I'm going to put on the screen right here 7 different aeration products you can include with your soil, and of course we've already talked about 2 of them, was the pine bark and this right here. But let's take a look at those, and you may actually have some of those around your house, your greenhouse, your garage, and make sure you add that in there in that proportion that I talked about earlier. Now, one mistake I've made in the past is when I planted them directly into the hole that I was planting them, I put the fertilizer in the hole with them or down below, thinking that the roots would grow into the fertilizer and it would really help tremendously. But actually that's creating what's called a fertilizer pocket, and it can burn the roots very quickly. If you're using, whether it's organic dry fertilizer or synthetic fertilizer, dry type, put it in the hole and you think you've done something wonderful. Actually, you can burn the roots very easily. So just remember that when you go to plant it, take your fertilizer, if it's a dry fertilizer, and mix it in with your soil, and then add it around the outer area of the planted plant, the planted tomato, because you want to make sure that you don't burn your roots as soon as it goes in there, and you'll have a suddenly dying tomato plant, won't know why. So that fertilizer pocket is the next thing we need to be very careful when we're engineering our soil root zone. Now, you can use a very mild starter mix, and this is how I make it. I use 1 tablespoon of worm castings. I'll put a link in the description to this product if you can't find it at your local store, and 1 tablespoon of blackstrap molasses, unsulfured molasses, and that contains a lot of great things for tomato plants. You have your minerals, you have your sugars, and this has a lot of bacteria in it, or excuse me, a lot of microbes in it that are going to be very beneficial for your tomato plants. So these put into 1 tablespoon each into 1 gallon of water, and then use about 1 cup on each of your newly planted tomato plants, and that will give it a great start without having to worry about the fear of burning your roots at the very initial stages of planting. Next, I'm going to talk about mulching like a professional. Now, this particular plant is a cherry tomato, grape tomato, and I plan on leaving it in this pot to see how much it will produce. But I do the same method when I'm mulching out in the open garden or my raised beds. I use a very finely shredded pine bark, and it's extremely important because this is stabilizing the soil moisture, it's reducing the temperature swings, it's preventing soil splash. In other words, if you had diseases in your soil, when you go to water it, it doesn't splash back up on the plant. It's going to reduce disease spread. It's going to keep roots cooler in the hot weather. It's going to reduce weed competition, and it's going to overall improve soil structure over time. I blend this into my soil at the end of the season so it can break down over the winter. Now, I wanted to give you a look at the actual brand. This is a very finely shredded pine bark, and it's actually my favorite. I think it looks great when it's in the garden, but if you can't get access to this, this is actually sold at Lowe's Warehouse. It's a big hardware store here in the States, in their garden center. I don't even think it's sold at Home Depot. I haven't been able to find it there. But if you don't have access to this, you could use something like grass clippings, pine straw, hay, any number of things. But just remember that if you do use grass clippings, make sure it's not after that it's started to go to seed. You're seeing seeds in the grass when you go to cut it, because those seeds will ultimately start sprouting in your garden. So this is my #1 favorite mulch that I use all around the garden. Now, another important thing to remember about our root zone and our soil engineering is we don't want to water the plant from up here. We want to water it from right here at the root zone. In these particular plants in this bed, I actually have a micro irrigation system in place, but you could use something as simple as a watering can. Just make sure you don't water from up above. You want to water right there at the root zone. This is going to help slow down any diseases that might be in the soil and prevent diseases from ending up in your plant, which will ultimately result in very low harvest and a very poor outcome for the health of your plant. Now, I've used secret #2 on this one right here, and it is called controlled stress. We don't want the plant to be receiving the perfect amount of water, the perfect amount of situation all the time. We want to add a little bit of stress to the plant so that it will be in that state thinking that it could possibly die, and then that will start generating more flowers, ultimately producing more fruit. So a lot of gardeners think this is abusing the tomato plant, but no, it's not actually. It's just giving it some light stress to make sure that it produces tomato and just not green growth. If the tomato plant is not facing any stress, then it will just keep growing more leaves and not producing any flowers or ultimately tomatoes. So just remember that light stress we're going to talk about next is secret #2. Now, these cherry tomatoes, I've used some of this light stress on there, and one of the first step we're going to talk about when we're controlling the stress is we're going to stop feeding it like you're growing lettuce. We want to stop giving it so much nitrogen because we want to pull back on that. This is a big mistake homeowners and gardeners make. Tomatoes are fruiting plants. They need nitrogen, but too much nitrogen is going to push leaf growth and you're going to have nothing but leaves. These, I've slowed down the nitrogen and I'm seeing much better tomato production. So you're going to have, if you have too much nitrogen, you're going to have bigger leaves and fewer flowers and delayed fruiting, softer growth, more pest attraction, more disease pressure, and lower fruit production overall. So as you can see, there's a lot of flowers here and a lot of tomatoes growing on these particular tomato plants. So the next way we're going to use this light stress method on your tomato plants is we're going to remove lower limbs from the plant. We're going to remove suckers that may be growing out of the elbows. This hasn't started those, but I see one tiny one starting there. So you want to remove these suckers from those elbows, and that way the plant stops using energy to produce branches and leaves and it starts pushing towards creating more fruit. So this light stress method is going to help your tomato plants overall. It's a lot of work, but once you get used to doing this, and you only have to do it maybe 1 or 2 days a month, but make sure that you're not allowing these excessive growth happening and a lot of greenery happening. We want to focus all the energy of the plant into fruit production. Now the next way we're going to use stress on our tomato plants is we're going to use disciplined watering, and we don't want to just keep the plant always saturated with water. If we don't allow the top 1 to 2 inches of soil to dry out, the plant can be in this perfect state of bliss. It's just creating more and more leaves, more and more branches, and growing and not producing tomatoes. So that could be a reason that if you're overwatering and not allowing this drying effect or this stress effect to take place, that could be why your tomatoes are not producing. So the next thing we're going to do to give the plant some light stress is either shaking the tomato cage or shaking the plant itself about late morning, something like that. But you're just going to shake it like that to help reduce some of the pollen. We rely on bees and things like that, wind, natural things to create the pollen. Even though they're self-pollinating or they're self-fruiting, we want to make sure that we just do that to help spread some of the pollen. So you can take a toothbrush, an electric toothbrush, and just vibrate around each flower, go from flower to flower and help spread the pollen, and that will also create a much better effect. So this kind of stress is a little bit different, but we are doing that to make sure that our tomato plants is pollinated properly. Now, secret number 3 is calcium flow into your tomato plant, which will greatly increase your growth of your tomatoes. Now I'm going to put on the screen right here a list of things that you can use. I've also got a video that I'll link up here about how to use eggshells. I think that oyster shell ground up powder, I've got some of that around the greenhouse, works great as well. But you want to make sure that it is as fine a powder as possible, or use the eggshell idea here I have in this video that will make it work even better. But calcium flow is an extremely important thing in our tomato plant. Now, calcium flow can be inhibited if your soil is dry below the 2-inch mark. Now, I said that the 1 to 2 inch is fine at the surface, but once you get below that, you need to have moisture, because dry soil going 3, 4, 5 inches could really be a problem with the calcium flow going from soil to plant. So pick up one of these moisture meters. They're not expensive, they're 20 bucks. If you can't find one, I'll put a link in the description. But occasionally test your soil below 3 and 4 inches, because not everybody is going to be watering exactly the same way. So you just want to make sure that your calcium has enough moisture to go from the soil to the plant. Now, we're still talking about calcium flow, and if you're growing your tomatoes in containers, and this one is probably going to receive a special wrap pretty soon, I'm going to take some aluminum foil and wrap it around the outside so it'll reflect some of the sunlight and heat, because if this heats up too quickly, the soil is going to dry out very quickly, and then we're going to have that problem below the 2-inch mark, which will cause the problem with the lack of calcium flow because the soil is too dry. So just remember that if you have it in whatever size container, unless it's just a massive container, then you may want to wrap the outside of your pot with some aluminum foil, drape it over the lip so it won't blow away, and then that will kind of cut down quite a bit on the heat of the soil. Also, make sure you have at least 1 to 2 inches of the shredded pine bark, leaves, the grass cuttings, hay, whatever you have, and that will keep it from being a little bit more stable and drying out. So the calcium flow is a huge factor when we're talking about being in these pots. It can be a big problem when we're talking about the dead of summer and the heat. So those 3 things are what professional growers do when they're growing tomatoes to maximize their harvest. Engineering the root zone, managing the stress, and adding a little bit of light stress, and of course managing calcium. So those three things are three major secrets as to why professional growers produce tons of tomatoes in a very short season, even if they're far north or they're in an extremely humid or hot area that has a problem growing into those late months of August and September. Those three secrets will make a huge difference. So guys, I really appreciate you watching. As I said, there's an over 25-page PDF that goes into a lot more detail than this video. The video would probably be about 2 hours long if I went in and did every single thing that's listed in the PDF. So if you're a member of the Patreon, remember to go over and download it to your device or print out a copy of it. If you're not, for $4 or $5, you can get a copy of it and you can keep it on your device as well. And you'll always have that handy when you're starting your tomatoes every year. So guys, I really appreciate you watching and have a great day.